Oppressive bureaucratic power. We're moving beyond simple protest and asking a core strategic question. When you're confronting systemic control, where is the most effective battle actually waged? Is it through mass, external systemic friction, what you might call bureaucratic warfare, or is it through a radical internal individual psychological transformation? The path towards, say, ego transcendence. My position is that effective resistance has to be pervasive and collective, focusing on creating a constant and tangible drag on the external system's efficiency, essentially turning the apparatus of control into an engine of its own destruction.
And I come at this from, well, a completely different direction. While disrupting bureaucracy sounds pragmatic, and I get the appeal, it ultimately just addresses the system's output, the rules, the paperwork. It doesn't get to the root source of control, which is the internal psychology of the individual. I argue that true liberation requires a catastrophic, self-engineered psychological shock to the individual ego. The primary struggle is always internal. It's about forging a state of anti-fragile mastery where those external systems just lose their fundamental grip on your constructed reality.
Okay, so to start, let's talk about that strategy. This is fundamentally counter-cybernetics. And for listeners who might be unfamiliar, cybernetics, as Norbert Wiener defined it, it's basically the science of control and communication in machines and in organisms. So if the centralized state uses cybernetics to manage information, enforce compliance, and, steer society, then resistance has to deliberately introduce noise and friction into that external flow.
And this strategy isn't new. It's rooted in guides like the old OSS Simple Sabotage Manual. The goal is the citizen saboteur, someone who can operate right in plain sight. They achieve effectiveness by imposing administrative work and wasting resources. For instance, instead of listing every specific technique, just consider the philosophy behind, say, the art of the endless clarification. The resistance fighter continuously demands clarification on every minor inconsistency or ambiguity in writing. You force the bureaucracy to divert its own specialized manpower to clarify its own errors. You're wasting hours, budget on self-justification rather than oppression. The cumulative effect of thousands of these subtle, deniable acts is what fundamentally erodes the morale and efficiency of the whole system.
The problem with external counter-cybernetics, though, is that the system can always adapt. It can create a new form, hire more administrators. You're fighting a logistical battle you are, I think, unlikely to win in the long term. I contend that the most sophisticated form of control operates not in the government office, but within the mind itself.
Okay.
The primary mechanism of oppression is sustained by a rigid psychological structure, the ego. Now, the ego is necessary. It's essential organizing principle. It operates on the reality principle, helping you manage tasks and define who you are. But when this structure becomes overly rigid, fueled by shame or deep-seated insecurity, it becomes the internal accomplice of external tyranny. The system controls the individual through their fear of stepping outside their own rigid identity. To break this, the path cannot be the slow, integrative right-hand path, the RHP of gradual self-improvement, which honestly often just leads to stagnation. It has to be the velocity of the left-hand path, the LHP of transgression, a deliberate, self-engineered psychological catastrophe. We call this narcissistic mortification. You force a breakdown of the existing self-structure, that whole edifice of self-defense we call pride, down to zero, allowing a new anti-fragile structure to emerge. This process, achieved through intense transgressive experiences and high volatility environments, forces the neurological disintegration of the default mode network.
Wait, hold on. You're using a lot of clinical terms here. LHP integration. Can you just clarify the psychological outcome? And why must the resistance strategy rely on what sounds like, frankly, self-immolation rather than collective action?
Absolutely. Let's simplify it. The ego and its neurological correlate, the default mode network, or DMN, is the brain's default setting for self-referential thought, identity, rigid self-narratives. When we talk about DMN disintegration, we mean temporarily shutting down the brain's rigid identity processor. The outcome isn't madness, but freedom from the self-imposed limitations that those external systems rely on. We focus on transgression and shock because for the deeply entrenched individual, logic doesn't heal shame. It just doesn't. Only a radical psychological shock can force a fundamental rewrite. This process forges an anti-fragile nervous system that can process high volatility without glitching, and it culminates in what we call the integrated Jester King archetype, an individual who can embody contradiction and flux, and who is therefore immune to the system's psychological demands. This ultimate autonomy is resistance.
I see the power of that argument for individual freedom, I do. But you pivot away from the critical reality that systems of power actively shape and control the shared external reality that the rest of us inhabit. We acknowledge the remarkable power of internal belief. I mean, we know of medical cases, like the man whose tumors disappeared simply because he believed he received an effective drug. But collective resistance has to actively shape that shared reality, not just escape it internally. This is where methods like hyperstition come in. Hyperstition, in simple terms, is narrative warfare. It's the crafting of concepts or narratives that are so potent that the very belief in them causes them to manifest into reality. We have to craft narratives that frame the resistance as righteous and morally necessary, building a shared psychological fortress within society. Internal transformation doesn't manifest these narratives. External action does. The bureaucratic sabotage, the pressure, the chaos, that is what ensures those narratives manifest and become the new reality. It shifts the societal agreement on what is even possible.
You know, that's a fair point about shaping shared reality. But I would argue that controlling your internal reality is the prerequisite for shaping the shared one. The external systems, be they governmental or bureaucratic, rely on the population's collective adherence to a single, agreed-upon reality model. If the individual achieves a radical, validated autonomy over their own reality, and I mean validated by surviving a deep psychological collapse, they are already liberated from the system's primary tool, consensus. Let's use a simpler example. Think about an individual who has mastered their perception of chaos. Through this intense path of psychological transformation, they learn to process deep fear, anxiety, paranoia, the very emotional tools of control, not as paralyzing disorders, but as mastered states of high-tension balance. Why would you bother disrupting the external system with paperwork if you've already mastered the source code of your own sensory input and emotional response? You are functionally outside their control apparatus.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because the internal path, as you've described it, is fundamentally unscalable and, well, devastatingly high risk. We're talking about resistance for the population, for the average citizen who recognizes oppression. The power of simple sabotage lies in its accessibility and its deniability. Anyone can be a citizen saboteur. They can act stupid or feign profound confusion, the lost in translation gambit, to slow down information processing. In a modern context, anyone can overload the system by making numerous, very specific public records requests in inconvenient formats. We call this the public records rabbit hole. This is a practical, low-risk way to create a cumulative effect multiplied across thousands of people that creates that tangible drag on operations. It is a resistance built on sheer volume and low-risk engagement, which is the polar opposite of the deeply personal, catastrophic journey you're proposing.
But the focus on practicality and low risk completely ignores the existential threat of psychological stagnation. For many individuals, especially those deeply entrenched in shame or paralyzed by the system's psychological conditioning, conventional paths are useless. They are already in a state of systemic stagnation. So the path of radical shock is high risk, yes. It involves failure, fragmentation, potential self-harm. I fully acknowledge that danger. However, for the individual where that stagnation is already the baseline, where a life of quiet conformity is its own slow suicide, this radical shock is the only viable route to achieve the grail of true autonomy. If you're already mentally suffocating, the risk of external friction is negligible compared to the reward of absolute is resistance at its most potent and uncompromising form. Let's just return to the source of control. Wiener stated that cybernetics analyzes both machines and organisms. Well, the machine metaphor applies directly to the human brain. The ego is the central organizing principle that establishes the psychological rigidity that external oppression leverages. If control is exercised internally, the fight must be internal cybernetics, disrupting the internal control system. The goal is to force that DMN disintegration, the neurological equivalent of rewriting the self's operating system, to achieve a transcendence that renders external controls meaningless.
I have to rebut that because focusing solely inward ignores the systemic external concentration of power that leverages cybernetics against the population. The state uses these tools to enforce specific, controlled realities. Therefore, resistance must be counter-cybernetics aimed at the external communication and governance channels. I mean, we see this weaponization of central authority constantly. Look at recent political attempts to pressure companies like ABC Disney trying to influence content and force them to pull shows. Or the documented instance of the quiet deletion of a Department of Justice study that contradicted the government's narrative on far-right extremism. These are textbook examples of using central power to control information flow and governance. Disrupting the bureaucracy, making the information flow incoherent, slow, and expensive, is the necessary external counterattack to this sophisticated system of control. Ultimately, my position rests on efficacy and collective action. Effective resistance depends on practical, widespread acts that impose administrative work, waste resources, and erode the efficiency of the bureaucratic state. This chaos creates the space for collective freedom to emerge. The apparatus of control has to be destroyed by its own operational overhead and its own inefficiencies.
And mine rests on ultimate autonomy. The truest form of resistance is an internal achievement, a high-tension, volatile state of constant psychological balance where the individual has shattered the oppressive psychological structures imposed both by society and by their own tyrannical ego. They gain mastery over their own reality model, making them functionally untouchable by any external mandates.
What both strategies share, however, is a recognition that fundamental change, whether it's systemic or psychological, requires the introduction of powerful chaotic forces to shatter rigid, unsustainable structures.
Right. Leaving the listener to weigh the efficacy of applying that chaotic force to the system around us, or to the psyche within us.